We are absolutely delighted to be hearing from Hannah Bowles, who is a lecturer and negotiation expert at Harvard. One of the really exciting parts about this particular guest speaker is that this actually came to us through one of our book club reads where we read the negotiation method, how to get what you want from the Harvard negotiation experts. And while we were discussing this book, we really found that we felt that as women, we might want to learn a little bit more about how gender plays into negotiation and hear from experts to build on what we learned from Getting to Yes in really advancing our careers as women. And then we're thrilled to have some of our allies here as well today so that they can understand too how negotiation may be impacting how they view gender and how their gender may be impacting their negotiations. So Hannah, will have you take it away.
Thank you. I'm delighted to have a chance to engage with you all. I love that you've been doing this other reading, so that'll make us that'll facilitate our diving in quickly. Let me share my slides. First, I should say right off the bat, it's delightful to be with you all. I have a lot of conversations with women in science. It was really fun to get a bit of an overview of your organization to start this. So kudos to you all for being so, I don't know, organized, standing together, learning together. Sounds like a really beautiful group. So what I want to do is I'm going to talk about two main topics. One is helping you think about how to get up on the balcony, in essence, and understand where biases might lurk in negotiation contexts. And then I want to show you the negotiation preparation workbook that I've developed coming out of that research. So the workbook's fairly simple. It took a lot of years of boiling down, you know, 36 steps to 27 steps to finally giving in to my research fellows that it need to be a lot shorter. But when I walk through the four steps of this Be Sure negotiation preparation framework, you will see, because I've talked about the research, what the logic is behind each step. So I want to, that's kind of my aim. As academics, I welcome interruptions and questions. So I'm really happy to have a bit of a conversation here. Please put, and making sure I got my chat up here, please don't hesitate to put questions in the chat or to interrupt. I'll make sure that I also save some time at the end for a conversation, but maybe we can even get a little bit of conversation going in the chat as we move along. I'm going to move things along here so I can see at least those of you who are on the screen, and then also the chat box here. Okay, so let me get started. So my objectives, kind of as I've foreshadowed, are to illuminate contextual factors that heighten the potential for gender and other intersecting identities to influence negotiation. I am using gender primarily right now to refer to men and women because that's where most of the data are or how they've been collected. I tend to use gender because, and you all will probably appreciate this as biologists, I don't really have a lot of biological information on most of the people in our studies. And then one of the things that I've done in recent years is a couple of probably the most up-to-date comprehensive reviews on gender and intersecting identities in negotiation. And again, like we're really primarily looking at comparisons of people who identify as men and women. There is not a lot of research on non-binary identities. There's a little bit of stuff on LGBTQ identities. We've got some increasing stuff around other intersecting identity characteristics, and I'll raise that. But I'll also leave it to the Q&A if we want to dive in. I'm going to primarily talk from patterns that emerge across dozens or scores of studies. So we don't, the research on intersecting identities is less well developed. And so again, I'm going to primarily talk about gender trends. I'll talk about how we can think at a high level about intersecting identities, but please don't hesitate to ask if we want to dive into that more deeply. I'm going to focus on career-related negotiations. I think that's relevant to your group. And that's also where I've done most of my research. And then again, we'll go to this in the end, this preparation workbook. So here are my 4 steps, which I think will hopefully make sense in 20 minutes or so more. But it's basically to start with your goals, understand what you're negotiating for, and I'll walk through what I mean by that. Reduce ambiguity, and you'll see when I walk through the research why that's important. And then I have this idea of how do you think about enhancing your negotiations through relationships, and then how do you use strategies like some of the ones you would have read about in Getting to Yes about enhancing your relationships through negotiations. So if you remember only one thing from this talk, I hope you'll remember that the gender of a person or their sex, as far as we've been able to, whatever term you want to use, gender is evoking different things. Say it again.
I tried to text you, but my cellular is not set up.
Should I
I think that
pause?
might be a mistake.
Might be just a mistake. Okay, good. All right. So the gender of a person is really not a reliable predictor of their behavior. So if I just bring men and women into my lab, or I go out and watch them in the world, they're not going to behave reliably differently enough for me to say publish studies. There are, however, systematic effects of gender under particular situations. So what I want to highlight for you all are under what are those conditions under which we tend to observe gender effects? One of those is pay negotiations, which is obviously a really important realm. I want to unpack that a little bit, why we would see effects there. But one thing that motivated some of these reviews and some of my research that I've done in recent years is that the effects that we observe in pay negotiations, self-advocating for higher pay, are not generalizable to all forms of negotiation. So if we only talk about pay negotiations, we can create an impression about women as negotiators or women and men as negotiators. That's not really generalizable. The second thing is that even if all you care about is the gender pay gap, it's not clear to me that just focusing on pay negotiations is smart. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Primarily, it relates to the fact that the gender pay gap is mostly explained by men's and women's career trajectories and where they find themselves employed. And so if you're thinking about what do I negotiate to affect my career path, it's more than how much you're going to pay me in the current job that I'm in. Okay. So just to highlight one really straightforward effect, situational effect, even in the realm of negotiating for higher pay, is the simple effect of saying to you, okay, you're negotiating the example of an experiment that I'll show you, you're negotiating your pay for yourself, or I'm going to put you in the same situation, give you the same information. I'm going to say, you're going to negotiate the pay for this person. So maybe we could start in the chat. Maybe you could enter self or you could enter other. Who would find it easier to negotiate for other than for themselves? So easier, enter, let me put in here, what's easier, and then self or other. And then if you have a chance to put in what you think. Okay, we're pretty uniform other, some people, yeah, okay. So some people, occasionally it's easier for somebody to do for themselves, or, they say, I know the situation better, I'm not inhibited. But these are pretty robust effects for women, particularly in individualist cultures, of negotiating, finding it easier to negotiate for others than for themselves. And part of this has to do with social expectations. We idealize women putting others before themselves. And there are these kind of implicit norms that when a woman violates that, it's just not that, it's not socially attractive, and this is these stereotypes that influence these things are kind of generally held as a function of our perceptions of society. It's really not a battle of the sexes. So it's not like men think women should do this and women have another view. Women also expect women to be putting others before themselves. So if you look at I'm just going to show you this graph because this is the easiest way. This is one of the first studies that we ran, obviously some time ago, but these effects have since been replicated and shown through meta-analyses. And this is a pretty robust pattern. So this is a study. I like showing this one, I have to admit, because the white bars are negotiating for yourself. The gray bars are negotiating for others. These were female executives, fairly senior professionals and executives in a program that we were running. And the women negotiating for others just killed everybody else. They did so well. But this goes back to this idea that, you know, you can't overgeneralize from, okay, if women might feel these white bars aren't even statistically significantly different. But if the women are doing slightly less well or significantly less well self-advocating for pay, it does not say anything about them in general as negotiators. And I think this is actually extremely important, particularly as we talk about this research for folks from, you know, young professionals who are coming up, who might hear over and over again, you know, oh, women don't negotiate, women always hesitate, when actually it could very well be a strength that they have, and they you know, they might feel like, am I different because this is something I'm good at or like to do. So I really want to emphasize it's not about the person, it's really about the situation. And the reason why the self-advocacy is more inhibiting for women, we now have a lot of evidence to show it's because they actually run into more resistance than men do when they attempt to self-advocate. So they run into both material resistance in the sense of there are a lot of field studies now showing that women, or showing evidence of women reporting to negotiate as often as men for higher pay. Although there is also field evidence, I'll talk about when that might not happen, but there's a lot of field evidence where you go out and you ask people like MBAs, graduating MBAs, or there's another study that was done in Australia, you know, have you negotiated for higher pay? The rates at which men and women are reporting negotiating. But then when you ask them, have you negotiated successfully for higher pay? Men report higher rates of success. We also have evidence of women suffering what is sometimes referred to as social backlash or social resistance. So evidence that people feel like, oh, you know, when we randomly assign you to evaluate a woman who lets an opportunity to negotiate pass, or really is very non-assertive in her response, people in that condition will report a greater liking or willingness to work with the woman as compared to people who are assigned to a condition to see or read about the same woman who then goes to negotiate assertively for higher pay. And so it's that difference between how do I treat you? Let me go back here. How do I treat you if you're advocating assertively for others versus how do I treat you if you're advocating assertively for yourself? And I'll show you results here from one study that was done. It was pretty clever, where they looked at whether you're advocating for yourself or you're advocating for your team, and primarily around pay issues. And so I'm going to focus you primarily on the left here. So this is intent to backlash in the sense of like, I'm less inclined to work with this person. Social backlash is kind of like a dislike, or I'm less inclined to do things with this person. Leader backlash relates to, I don't tend to, I don't tend to see this person as a leader, would be higher intent to backlash as a leader. So if you can just stay focused on the social backlash for a moment. Again, this is like, I don't really know if I want to work with this person. What you see is that when women are non-assertive, it really, it kind of doesn't matter. They're, you know, they like her more or less the same, but it's really just when they are self-advocating in an assertive way where you increase your risks of backlash. Now, on the leader evaluation, oh, I have a bar to highlight that. On the leader evaluation, what you see is another kind of backlash, that if the woman is not assertive on behalf of others, right? So this is a prescriptive stereotype that women are advocates for others. And so if she's being non-assertive in her advocacy for others, then she's not perceived as leader-like, which is quite interesting. You know, it kind of goes back again to, you can't just say like women this, women cooperative, men competitive or something. The effects don't really look like that. But the key takeaway, not to overcomplicate this, is that self-advocacy in a competitive negotiation context that is masculine stereotyped, and I'm going to walk through this, particularly when there's ambiguity about what is negotiable, that's the constraint space. So let me lay this out in a kind of graphic. So you can think about the degree to which gender is relevant and salient as something that could go up or down like a lever. And then you can think also about another lever being the degree to which the situation is ambiguous. So do I know what is negotiable? Do I know how to negotiate? Do I know kind of who the other, how much am I individuating, like really understanding who the other counterpart is? So where we are most likely to see gender effects are in situations that are highly gendered. Pay, as an example, is something that's associated. Men tend on average to be paid more or be in higher paid positions than women do in society. Men are still associated, in spite of the changing structure of families, still associated with being the breadwinners. There's a lot of evidence to show that pay negotiations, self-advocacy and pay negotiations is very masculine stereotyped. And then there's a lot of cases in compensation negotiations, not only over like your salary, but also all different types of benefits, that not all these things are really visible. I mean, people don't really know exactly what the appropriate standards are. They're not exactly sure, how do I go about talking about this? And it is under those circumstances, when there's a fair degree of ambiguity and then gender is salient, where we're most likely to see our effects. So if I go back to this point about, under what conditions, like I'm not going to get effects if I just invite men and women in the lab and have them do different, like just any sort of random off the shelf negotiation. I'm not going to collect data. Well, I'm not going to collect data in situations where gender is less salient, or I shouldn't say that. I'm not going to predict gender effects in situations where gender is less salient. So things like, if I'm running a negotiation and people are advocates for others, where that kind of relieves that pinch for women, I'm not going to go in trying to study gender differences in a scenario of people negotiating for others, because that's a situation that's gender congruent for both men and women. I really wouldn't expect to see effects. Similarly, even if let me move ahead, even if I were to run a pay negotiation and then I give people very clear information about what are the negotiating norms, what are the negotiating standards, if I give them really good objective information about what it is that they should be doing, I'm not going to get gender effects. I mean, that would be kind of a waste of my time to try to run a gender and negotiation study. It's really primarily up in that northeast quadrant there, that those are the conditions under which I'm going to find gender effects, or I'm going to manipulate some of these situational factors. I'm going to show that it shows up in that dark gray box, but not in some of these others. If I can give you one illustration that might be relevant to you all, this is from a program that I did with astrophysicists like some years ago, and I was presenting some of this research, particularly around ambiguity. And one woman came up to me after the fact. She said she had just signed on to a postdoc, and right before she was going to sign her contract, she got a flyer that said postdocs are eligible for summer support. So right before signing the contract, she went in and she said, "Oh, I would like to be eligible for summer support." And they said, "Oh, great." And I mean, that is like a significant increase in I don't know how it works for you guys in the biological science, but in a lot of sciences, you're really just paid on a 9-month salary and then you have to figure out your summer. So just the fact that she had that clarity of information, if it is not clear whether things like summer support or other types of benefits are available, and women are more inhibited than men to do some of this self-advocacy, that's where you get inequalities in outcomes. So this is a fairly simple example. I want to walk through some of what we know about situational factors that moderate the salience, relevance, and perceived relevance and salience of gender in negotiation. So one of them, and anybody have any questions? I'm kind of zipping along here. Should we please throw them please feel free to interrupt or to throw anything in the chat. And I'll get
I have a question.
Oh, good.
So kind of on that, it often feels like HR wants us to have that ambiguity, that we're discouraged from talking about what other
Yeah.
people's salaries are and other people's benefits. And so even before negotiations starts, what's your advice for going on that fact finding to reduce ambiguity to sort of help with, because whether something is a gendered stereotyped negotiation or not, like that's sort of set. But if we can reduce the ambiguity, that can be to our benefit. So do you have advice on that?
I would do exactly what you're saying. I mean, honestly, if there's like one piece of concrete advice to take away from this, it is that. Yeah, and this type of a network would be a great place to start sharing that information. Even just to know what are all the components of a package, for instance, that you should be talking to people about. So I'll give you an example. This is unpublished and this is still working paper research, but it illustrates kind of what your, so I just want to be clear, we haven't run this through peer review and published it yet, but we've been doing some experimenting with looking for advice through AI for your negotiations. And then we self-present as either man or female. And we're also manipulating the age of the person and stuff. But we're finding some evidence that if you present yourself as a man, you're, for instance, more likely to get a bunch of information about financial options and severance and a variety of these things. And then if you present yourself as a woman, you get more detailed information about like flexible work arrangements and parental leave and a variety of these things. Now, this is probably just AI like telling you what it thinks you want to hear. But that's a great example where like if you haven't got all the information and then you're just, you're just relying kind of on what people have told you what they think you are interested in, you could for instance not negotiate a severance. I mean, I don't think I don't know how relevant severance is for you guys, but in the business sector, like people could not negotiate things just because they don't even know that they're there. And if different types of people get different types of information, then that's where inequalities arise. I mean, a lot of sometimes what you're emphasizing is so critically important. There's also evidence about women getting lower offers, including in the sciences, than men, lower initial compensation offers. And so if you don't have a good sense of what the general standards are, you could just say, okay, well, I'm going to negotiate up from whatever it is they offered me. And if both a man and a woman negotiate up 10% from what they were initially offered, they both negotiated equally effectively in terms of getting their extra 10%, they could still end up at an unequal place, even if they were, equally good negotiators. So having that really good information is just critical. Thank you for asking that question. Yeah, that's such a crazy example of bias in AI. It's so interesting. I mean, I think it's really about like you just got to kind of yeah, it's really interesting. It's really interesting. We have so much to learn about that. So culture, I'm just going to do this really quickly, but just so we understand again how flexible these things can be. So in what some of the latest evidence shows is that the stereotypes of men tend to follow the idealized cultural norms. So in a place like the United States, which has a very individualist culture, and where we've done a lot of this negotiation research, men are associated with, this is my kind of my birds on the right here, the individualist birds are just focused on filling their own, seed basket. Whereas the collectivist birds are focused primarily on filling the collective bowl for seeds. And so what you associate men with is this more of this individualism, competitiveness, self-assertive type of behavior more in individualist cultures than you do in collectivist cultures. And what ends up happening is that the stereotypes of women are kind of counter to that. So in an individualist culture, if people are kind of fulfilling stereotypes and I put men and women in a competitive bargaining exercise, who would you predict on average would win? So let me just put it in the chat here. Individualist culture, competitive bargaining, who wins, question mark, men or women, what would you predict kind of on average? What would you see? And again, I'm going to hype up, yeah, men kind of on average. Okay. So, but what's really interesting is these meta-analyses have shown, let me switch this and I'm going to say collectivist culture rather than individualist culture. Who wins? It's actually, yeah, it's actually women on average, which is really interesting. Women start dominating in the outcome. They like collected all these different competitive bargaining exercises and showed this flip across cultural contexts. So now there's a lot of other things that are going on, like status and power and things like that. But it's really interesting to see the degree to which the cultural context influences these things. I would love to dive into this. I'm just going to hit this at a fairly high level, and then if we want to talk more about this, we can. But obviously, gender is not the only thing that it's not. It's one of our primary identity characteristics. There's a lot of research. It's one of the first characteristics that humans code, that babies code, or that humans will recognize about someone that they're when they're exposed to them. So there's a famous book by Cecilia Ridgway from Stanford, a sociologist, who wrote this book, Framed by Gender. And she really argues gender is this kind of primary frame organizing construct for society. However, in a specific situation, and again, I'm emphasizing how do we think about under what conditions these effects are going to emerge, gender is not always the most salient characteristic. So if you think about reducing ambiguity, again, if I know somebody by reputation as a professional, their professional reputation is likely to inform my expectations of how they will behave a lot more than their gender. But if I don't know somebody, so I'm going to get these more likely to get gender as information or gender influencing behavior, the more ambiguous the situation is, the less I know about them. But in some situations, other characteristics are more salient. So for instance, sometimes we'll see different effects, less resistance to women who are self-presented as being very senior as opposed to more mid-level, right? Because the senior person may be treated based on their seniority rather than on their gender, whereas maybe there's a little bit more ambiguity for someone at a mid-level or lower level role with regard to what I should expect of them, their behavior, and gender becomes maybe more salient or perceived to be more informative. Ethnicity or race is also really important to take into account, because when we only talk about men versus women, then we're not recognizing that most of the men versus women effects are actually associated with how do women fare as compared to men from the dominant group. So for instance, there is a study by Hernandez et al. Looking at how to participants respond when they put men in a negotiation for higher pay, and some of the men are Black and some of the men are white. Do they respond differently to the Black men, to the white men? And they find patterns of results that are similar to that resistance that I described to you to women's higher pay attempts. So they've shown that the more the Black men assert themselves for higher pay, the more resistant the counterpart becomes. Whereas the more the white man is asserting himself for higher pay, the more kind of concessions that person is likely to receive in return. So again, these things, it's not going to happen absolutely all the time, probably more likely to happen within ambiguous situations, more likely to happen if race is more salient. Let's say it's a counter stereotypical role for a person of color. But nonetheless, if you just say like men are always privileged and more privileged than women, then you're not taking into account these really important intersecting effects that are more about kind of patriarchy, in the sense that it's really domination by the dominant group of men as opposed to a kind of men versus women thing. So then organizational demography matters. I was just mentioning, this idea of, being a person of color, being somebody from the global South in a global cosmopolitan, like a multi national enterprise. A lot of these multinational enterprises or multinational spaces are really actually dominated by Americans and Europeans. And so one's identity as somebody from the global south becomes kind of salient. In this instance, I'm using, kind of red, more colorful birds to be men and paler birds as women. Um, so in a situation where you don't look like the group that dominates in your space, there may be more likely to be stereotypes activated. But another factor, which goes back to your question about reducing ambiguity and the importance of networks like the ones you guys have, is that if you have, say, this bird over here who's in the more gender diverse space, has lots of connections to people at multiple levels with whom they can identify readily and connect readily. And then this person here who is not as rich in peers or people like themselves, this person is going to have just better access to information to reduce ambiguity. And so what you see in studies are things like people who are in this position of being like in the minority within their workspace, they very often, their connections are outside in other organizations, not in the organizations in which they work, which has strengths and weaknesses, which I can talk about later. But the key thing is to think about the salience of the environment that you're in, the social environment. Okay. We've talked about pay. And I kind of foreshadowed this a little bit with my describing to you the type of feedback that we seem to be getting from AI. Pay is masculine negotiated, work family types of negotiation are feminine negotiated. There's more and more work now done lately around like negotiating for flexible work arrangements and things like that. And if we had started the work looking at the negotiation of work family arrangements, the first book that would have been written is not Women Don't Ask, it's Men Don't Ask, because it's just hard to do things that are counter stereotypical. What the good news in this is that when I've gone out and looked at professional career advancement and with, early career, mid-career, very senior people, overwhelmingly what they are negotiating are their roles. And I'm not seeing this. You're showing up. What is most salient is your contribution as a professional. And your role negotiations, going back to this argument about what do you need to negotiate for the gender pay gap, maybe even more important than negotiating pay, right? So if I'm negotiating for developmental opportunities and promotions or expansions of authority or the types of projects on which I want to be working so that I get into better and better jobs that are either more rewarding or more senior, that's actually the trajectory that's more likely to contribute to lifetime wealth than is just bargaining for a little bit more money in the job that you're in. Bargaining for a little bit more money, if you can do it in the job that you're in, is really good idea, and it tends to pay off. But I worry about over focusing women on just their compensation at the expense of thinking about, say, funding for international conference participation, funding for resources, funding for the size of your lab, funding or negotiating mentorship arrangements, or negotiating one's teaching or clinical load, or, there's a whole variety of things that what types of committees that you're on. Some committees are a time sink. Some committees are visibility enhancing. What are all of those things that, you should use this network that you formed here to give each other advice on. So ambiguity we've talked about, I'll go through quickly. Ambiguity about what enhances the potential for inequitable outcomes. Ambiguity about how to negotiate increases hesitance to negotiate because people worry about that social and material resistance that I've talked about more if they don't really know what the norms are than if it's totally clear how to go about doing this. Ambiguity about who, that is, who is my counterpart, matters because you want to, as I'm going to get into in a moment, you want to make the most persuasive arguments that you can. Do people see you clearly, your interests and your capabilities, so that they are offering you the types of opportunities that you would like to have? So, a key thing for organizations is to reduce ambiguity, to reduce bias. So really making sure that their organizations are clear themselves about how people get opportunities and how such opportunities are distributed. As an individual, you can diminish the likelihood of these types of biases by developing your negotiation competencies. More expert negotiators, better trained negotiators are less likely to, we find smaller gender effects with more experienced negotiators, but more trained negotiators. And then this reducing ambiguity is just key. So I'm going to walk quickly through these slides so we have, hopefully at least 10 or 15 minutes for just an open conversation. So one thing to think about in career negotiations, it's not just this like, I got a job offer and now I'm going to negotiate it. You have to think about negotiation as being informal. And it may not only be with work partners. I mean, you may also have really important negotiations to do with household partners or life partners with regard to how you're going to manage different choices that you want to make in your life. So many of us are kind of managing this on an almost daily basis or regular basis, surely. We've talked about these different types of negotiations, not to over focus on pay. So how to prepare, and I can make available to you this little workbook. Actually, I have a QR code at the end where you can access this little workbook, and we've got some videos linked to it. But here are these 4 steps, which I raised. So start with your goals. Again, when you think about your goals, don't just think about, what am I being offered, or just think about like, what are the compensation standards, but really think about what are my aspirations? Like, what is the next job I want to have? What are my kind of longer term academic aspirations or aspirations in industry? And what are the types of opportunities that I would like to have in order to get to that space? If work life if you are in a pinch moment for work life, you might also be thinking about, okay, how do I manage the work life front in order to again achieve my life aspirations, whether those are caregiving or professional. The understand what you're negotiating for. This is something that came out of this research looking at what professionals actually negotiate, and we observed 3 different types of negotiations. So asking negotiations are and I could put a little link to an HBR article at the end that may or may not be useful. It's not set in your context, but maybe after we've spoken, it'd be more relevant. But asking negotiations are like, what are the standard things that you can negotiate for? Like that example that I gave to you of summer salary. If that's a standard thing you can ask for, you go in and you explain why you meet the typical criteria used to get a particular resource. Bending negotiations are when what is typically offered is not what you're looking for. So you're looking for some sort of adaptation on the typical offer. And what's important about recognizing that, and this goes back to reducing ambiguity, which is my next one, is you really want to know, am I asking for something standard or am I asking for something exceptional? Because you're going to need to make a different type of argument for something exceptional than you're going to ask for something that's standard. And you may need to think about the fact that whereas in an asking negotiation, that might be a pretty quick negotiation with one person because this is routine. And if you're bending, if you're trying to get somebody to make an exception for you, they may need to negotiate with other people in order to treat you differently than they treat others. Shaping negotiations are when you want to actually change the system. It's not just about something standard for yourself or a special exception. You would actually like to change the way that work is done. So I'm going to give you a quick example from a panel that I was on recently with a woman who's a patent lawyer. And high ambiguity, there was this particular type of patent certification for which some people were compensated for getting, but not everybody. So, if you knew you could ask for compensation to get this particular certification, the firm would pay for it. And when this woman did this certification, she went to ask for this payment coverage of this certification and ran into a little resistance. And then she said, instead of saying, okay, well, if this isn't standard, instead of just negotiating for a special exception, well, even if it's not standard to pay for this training that I did to get to the certification, I want you to do this for me. What she did instead was to say, I bet you are treating women differently than men I think there should be a new policy basically with regard to payment for this type of certification, because when we have this certification, we can do more work for the firm. So there's no reason why some people should get this and others not. And so she ended up leading a whole process to basically change the policy within the firm. I hope that's illustrative. So reduce ambiguity, we've been talking about why this is so important, trying to figure out really what is negotiable, what are the norms for how to go about negotiating certain things, and then what do people really care about? What are they interested in? Do they understand what you care about, you're interested in, everything that you're bringing to the table? So this leads to the last part. So enhance your, it's a little ditty, enhance your negotiations through relationships, which is who could help you get information, advice, social support, advocacy. This seems like a great network to be doing that type of work in. And then finally, this goes back to getting to yes, right? And it's not only because Getting to Yes said this, we actually ran a bunch of studies trying to figure out how women can self-advocate and both be persuasive and minimize the risks of that social backlash that we were seeing. And what we found across studies was that arguments, and we tried out a whole bunch of different scripts, that arguments that combined, as you've been reading about within Getting to Yes, arguments that combined an explanation of why is what I'm asking for legitimate, in that other person's eyes, not just your eyes. Why is it legitimate in their eyes? And then how are you showing that you're taking their interests into account? And so if you are asking, doing one of those standard negotiations, you want to figure out, you don't want to make the case, well, I'm asking for this because this is standard practice, or this is precedent, or, somebody with my qualifications, peer institutions do this, what I mean, like a whole, or I understand other peers within this institution have been given this opportunity. I would also like to have this opportunity. And I understand you have this policy because XYZ, right? To retain talent or to grow the capacity of your talent or whatever it is, to innovate, to grow. What are the interests of the organization that would be met by granting what you're asking for? Again, if you're bending, you want to think about why is making an exception in your case justified. And so you have to really think about from their perspective, what would be the argument for why, how would they explain to somebody else why they would give you this special benefit? And then if you're shaping, if you're trying to change an organizational policy, what you're really trying to make a case for is why is it in the strategic interest, the long-term interest of the whole group? Why does it make sense for this organization to change the way it's doing this? So going back to that example of, well, we only pay some people for this particular type of investing and getting this particular type of certification. The argument is basically to say, you're accidentally, perhaps unintentionally, creating a bias system where one group of people is getting paid and another group of people is not, because it's highly ambiguous and totally subjective, and may relate on whether it may depend on whether people are assertively self-advocating for this thing. And it would be basically in the interest of the firm to have more people with this certification, and in the interest of the firm not to find themselves in a situation where there was bias. So you're taking, you're trying to come up with these legitimate and in their interest arguments that you guys have been reading about and Getting to Yes. So I think I'll pause there. I promised 9:50 to pause for open questions, but this is the main framework. Whoop. And maybe should I stop share and we just have a conversation?
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. That was really just, it went so far past a lot of the stuff that we learned in Getting to Yes. So if anyone has any questions or wants to ask for clarification.
I worked with Roger Fisher back in the day. Actually, that was the first person I worked with in the negotiation field a long time ago. So there's actually a lot of, it's written like an airplane book, but there's actually a lot of decision science underneath it. He worked very closely with a decision scientist named Howard Rifa. There's a lot of wisdom in that. It's a good choice.
So one thing that struck me, especially in that example you gave near the end of the lawyer with the certification, to me, it almost feels like shaping feels like advocacy for others. It's benefiting you because you're going to benefit in the long run, but it feels like benefiting others primarily in the future versus the asking and the bending. And so I wondered if there's any research that shows that women are more likely to go about negotiation through shaping rather than just asking or bending.
That is a great question. So we don't have that particular like experiment or data on frequency, but we theorize the same thing, and others have all. There's a little bit of evidence that if you can get women into more of a "I'm doing this for others" mindset, that they find themselves more assertive. Um, I think the only trick in that is that you could psych yourself up, I'm doing this for others, and then you could encounter the resistance. So the key thing is you want to still use these strategies, use your getting to yes type of strategies. But I think that one of the things that we found actually, so when we went and really looked at what people negotiate, you saw a much richer range of behavior than just some deficit model that women aren't as good as men or aren't as assertive as men negotiating for higher pay or aren't coming away with as good of deals. You saw this whole range. And one thing that was really interesting was that yes, to your point, women were doing a ton of shaping, and these were only a lot of these women were leaders, and that's a leadership behavior to surface an issue for the whole organization rather than to just negotiate something for yourself. So that is a behavior associated with leadership. And so, you saw more of that with the more senior women as you were going out. Now that's a bit of a selection issue. The women who get to be more senior, maybe they're more senior because they did more of that. But the other thing that we saw was that women, I mean, it only came out after blind coding. We're kind of asking people to, kind of recall an episode where they had negotiated. And the women, when blindly coding these examples, we saw that women were actually doing more bending than men were, which was not what we expected. And it had to do with two things. One of it was work and family. So these women were rising up to levels, and I think we've seen this in the sciences also, where you suddenly have this, the pipeline is filling, and then these lab cultures and industry culture, a whole variety of things are changing because you have these women in these roles and you have people who are, not uniformly, but for instance, will have caregiving responsibilities, are more likely statistically to have descriptively to have caregiving responsibilities than the men had who were holding the same types of roles. So you see women saying things like, I'm going to need to fly um, once every couple months or something, once a quarter to go see my dad. I need to check in with my dad. My dad's in another city and, he's getting older, and I'm just going to be a better leader if I can, and I can do my job remotely for that week, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, so what they do is they create new practices. Or if you think about within academia, how do we get parental leave policies? It started with some woman who was a senior woman, right, who goes in and negotiates with the dean, and she says, like, we got to figure this out. And then they come up with an arrangement for her, and then the next senior talented woman comes along, and they're like, well, geez, we'll give you the same deal that we gave the first woman, and then maybe that should be the basis for a policy. So some of this stuff is actually part of organizational change. But the other thing that they were doing, which I don't know if it might be relevant to you all, but is they were also negotiating alternative career paths than had existed before. So for instance, sometimes, everybody who's ever run this unit as an engineer, and the women were statistically kind of less likely to have been an engineer for a whole variety of factors that may have been nothing to do with their math skills or their competencies for that type of work. And so what they're going in and saying is, okay, well, I don't have an engineering degree, but you're not really using your master's in engineering very much when you're running this unit. And I have a strategic vision. I have operational experience. I've run cross-functional teams. I have international. I have all these things that you really need for this role. And so they were negotiating themselves into spaces that were, countertypical. And again, changing the organization's conceptions of who plays what roles. And on another example within the sciences is also shifts toward more practice-based work, like you see in more of the medical sciences, but like the OBGYNs or the pediatricians or the veterinary practices. Part of the reason why you see this like this sharp rise, and this is Claudia Golden, who recently won the Nobel Prize. She's done this work on historical perspectives on the gender pay gap, and she's got this new book called Career and Family. But she basically argues, and then other people are also arguing, that it's really a lot of the inequality is about the structure of work. And so what you can be a full, if you're in a practice, you can be a full professional without being on call constantly, because it's the unit that is on call, not the individual that is on call. And so where you still see more inequality, say in the medical sciences, would be in something like the surgeon. Like, I need this particular surgeon, and the surgeon's going to emerge the moment I need my surgery. Whereas if you're having a baby, you're going to get somebody in the practice, you know? And so you can think about, like, people negotiate. Again, this is a shaping. It could be a bending negotiation. Okay, well, I want to be the one person who's part-time, you know? But it could also be to say, how do we structure the work so that we can accommodate, say, a team with diverse life circumstances? One other thing related to this group, I was coaching a lawyer lately who's in this sort of a sandwich generation moment, young kids, really struggling parents, and was joining a new law firm and was tempted to negotiate for a part-time arrangement, because she just says, you know, I always want to be excellent at my job, and I don't want to sign on if I can't be excellent. And they basically said to her, no. No, like, we can revisit this in 6 months, but the typical trap is that you're working full time, but you're only paid part time. And because you have that commitment to excellence. So what we want to do is bring you on. And then if in 6 months this isn't working, then let's think about changing the arrangement. But being able to have those conversations, about the structure of work along multiple generations of senior as well as junior people within organizations or across networks like this can be really valuable.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I do want to be mindful of the time. We're almost on the hour, so folks need to hop off. Thank you so much for joining us today. Are there any other questions left for Hannah?
I don't know, but I saw somebody said that they're sharing the information that a young professor at my school negotiated for a lower teaching load this year because she's going up for tenure. That's a great story to tell and retell, and could be really useful to some other woman coming up, trying to figure out how to make that important year of her life, maximizing the value. Excellent. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate everything that you had to share with us today, Hannah.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.